Deep beneath the Caribbean Sea on October 27, 1962, inside the cramped diesel-electric submarine B-59, three Soviet officers were screaming at each other. The submarine's captain, Valentin Savitsky, wanted to launch the nuclear torpedo. The political officer, Ivan Maslenikov, agreed. They should fire. But the second in command, Vasili Arkhipov, was refusing. And his refusal was the only thing standing between that moment and nuclear war. Above them, American destroyers were dropping depth charges that exploded like thunder around the submarine's hull, each blast sending shock waves through the vessel, rattling equipment, terrifying the crew. The submarine had been submerged for hours, running on batteries that were nearly depleted. The air was thick, hot, almost unbreathable. Temperatures inside had climbed past 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Carbon dioxide levels were rising dangerously. Men were passing out from heat exhaustion and oxygen deprivation. The crew, 69 men packed into a steel tube thousands of miles from home, didn't know if war had already begun on the surface. They had received no communications from Moscow for days, and now American warships were attacking them with explosives that, for all they knew, signaled that World War III had started and they were under enemy fire. Captain Savitsky believed the time had come to use their most powerful weapon, a nuclear torpedo with the destructive force of Hiroshima. But Vasili Arkhipov was saying no. Vasili Alexandrovich Arkhipov was born on January 30, 1926, in a small village called Zworkovo, near Moscow, the son of a peasant family. His childhood was defined by Soviet collectivization and the hardships of rural life in the 1930s, when Stalin's policies caused widespread famine and suffering across the Soviet Union. Young Vasili grew up working on collective farms, learning early the values of discipline, endurance, and duty that would shape his character. When World War II came to the Soviet Union in 1941, he was just 15 years old, watching as the Nazi invasion devastated his country. By the time he was old enough to enlist, the war's later stages were underway, and Arkhipov joined the Soviet Pacific Fleet, serving in the final months of the war against Japan. The experience of serving his country in wartime left a deep impression. He had seen what war cost, what destruction looked like, how quickly violence could spiral out of control. After the war, he decided to make the Navy his career, enrolling in a naval academy and specializing in submarine operations. Archipov's career in the Soviet Navy was marked by steady advancement and exceptional performance. He graduated from the Caspian Higher Naval School in 1947 and later from the Naval Academy in 1957. He was known as a careful, methodical officer who valued preparation and clear thinking under pressure. His superiors respected his judgment, and his crews trusted him. By 1961, he had reached the rank of Captain Second Rank and was appointed Executive Officer of K-19, a brand-new nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarine, one of the Soviet Union's most advanced vessels. The appointment was prestigious, a sign that the Navy saw Arkhipov as one of its rising stars. But that assignment would also test him in ways no one could have predicted, in an incident that would prepare him for the even greater crisis he would face the following year. What happened aboard K-19 in July 1961 would both haunt Arkhipov and forge the judgment that would later save the world. K-19's maiden voyage as a fully operational nuclear submarine began in early July 1961, with orders to patrol in the North Atlantic demonstrating Soviet naval capabilities. But on July 4th, while the submarine was submerged in the Norwegian Sea, disaster struck. The nuclear reactor's cooling system developed a major leak. Without cooling, the reactor would overheat and trigger a meltdown, potentially causing a nuclear explosion that would kill the crew and create environmental catastrophe. The submarine had no backup cooling system, a design flaw that now threatened everyone aboard. Captain Nikolai Zateyev ordered emergency measures. Crew members would have to enter the contaminated reactor compartment and jury-rig a new cooling system using whatever materials were available. It was a suicide mission. The men who went into that compartment were exposed to lethal doses of radiation, their bodies absorbing enough gamma and neutron radiation to kill them within days or weeks. Arkhipov, as executive officer, supported the captain's decision and helped organize the repair efforts. 8 crew members died from radiation exposure, and many others suffered radiation sickness. But they saved the submarine and prevented the reactor from melting down. For his actions, Arkhipov received a commendation. But he also received something else, a dose of radiation that would affect his health for the rest of his life. The K-19 incident taught him several crucial lessons: that submarines were vulnerable, that nuclear weapons were extraordinarily dangerous, and that calm decision-making under extreme pressure could mean the difference between disaster and survival. Just over a year later, in October 1962, Arkhipov found himself at the center of another crisis, this one even more dangerous. The Soviet Union had secretly installed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the American coast, and American U-2 spy planes had discovered them. President John F. Kennedy responded with a naval blockade of Cuba, demanding the missiles be removed. The world held its breath as the two superpowers moved toward confrontation, neither willing to back down, both prepared to use nuclear weapons if pressed. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev ordered 4 Foxtrot-class diesel-electric submarines to the Caribbean to support Soviet operations in Cuba and to break through the American blockade if necessary. Each submarine carried 22 torpedoes, including 1 nuclear-tipped torpedo with explosive power equivalent to the Hiroshima bomb. Arkhipov was assigned to submarine B-59 with a special role. He was not only the executive officer of that submarine, but also the flotilla commander, second in command of all 4 submarines. This unusual dual role meant that on B-59, any decision to launch the nuclear torpedo required agreement from 3 officers: the captain, the political officer, and Arkhipov. The journey to the Caribbean was grueling from the start. The 4 submarines left their base in the Kola Peninsula near Murmansk and headed southwest across the Atlantic, operating under strict orders to maintain stealth and avoid detection by American forces. But the Americans knew they were coming. U.S. intelligence had detected the submarine deployment, and Navy ships were actively searching for them. The submarines were diesel-electric, meaning they ran on battery power while submerged, but had to surface regularly to run their diesel engines and recharge batteries. This made them vulnerable to detection. And the tropical waters of the Caribbean were far warmer than the Arctic waters the submarines were designed for, making operation difficult. The cooling system struggled in the heat, the batteries drained faster, and the crew suffered in temperatures the boat's ventilation couldn't handle. B-59, under Captain Valentin Savitsky, tried to avoid American detection by staying submerged as much as possible, but this meant running on batteries for extended periods, depleting their power reserves, and creating increasingly dangerous conditions inside the submarine. By October 27th, the day that would become known as Black Saturday, the most dangerous day of the Cuban Missile Crisis, B-59 had been tracked by U.S. Navy ships and was being hunted by a carrier battle group that included the aircraft carrier USS Randolph and 11 destroyers. The American forces had orders to locate Soviet submarines and force them to surface for identification. Their method was to use practice depth charges, small explosive charges that created loud underwater explosions but weren't designed to destroy the submarine. The depth charges were meant as signals, a way to communicate surface for identification to a submarine that couldn't receive radio messages while submerged. But from inside B-59, the crew had no way to know these were practice charges rather than actual weapons. All they heard were explosions getting closer, each one a terrifying reminder that they were under attack by vastly superior forces. B-59 had been submerged for hours, the batteries nearly dead, the air quality degrading, the heat becoming unbearable. Men were collapsing from heat stroke and oxygen deprivation. The crew, 69 men packed into a steel tube thousands of miles from home, didn't know if war had already begun on the surface. They had received no communications from Moscow for days, and now American warships were attacking them with explosives that, for all they knew, signaled that World War III had started and they were under enemy fire. Captain Savitsky believed the time had come to use their most powerful weapon, a nuclear torpedo with the destructive force of Hiroshima. But
Captain Savitsky, under extreme stress, concluded that war must have already begun. Why else would American ships be dropping explosives on a Soviet submarine? He had received no communications from Moscow for days. The submarine's deep position prevented radio contact, so he had no way to know the broader situation. For all he knew, the Americans had attacked the Soviet Union, nuclear war had started, and his submarine was being hunted as part of a general war. In that context, using the nuclear torpedo made a certain logic. If war had begun, their mission was to damage American forces as much as possible before being destroyed themselves. The nuclear torpedo could destroy an aircraft carrier and much of its escort group, killing thousands of American sailors and significantly damaging U.S. naval power in the region. Savitsky ordered the nuclear torpedo prepared for launch and turned to get the required approvals. The political officer, Ivan Maslenikov, immediately agreed. Soviet nuclear doctrine required approval from both the captain and the political officer for weapon launches, and they both concurred. But because Arkhipov held the position of flotilla commander, his approval was also required, and he was refusing to give it. The argument that followed was heated and desperate. Savitsky, according to later reports, shouted, "We're gonna blast them now! We will die, but we will sink them all! We will not disgrace our Navy!" His logic had a certain terrible rationality. If they were going to die anyway, crushed by depth charges or suffocated in the submarine, they should at least take the enemy with them, should strike a blow for their country before perishing. The political officer supported him, arguing that the Americans' aggression demanded retaliation, that Soviet honor required they fight back. The depth charges continued exploding outside, each blast reinforcing the captain's conviction that they were under attack. But Arkhipov argued against launching. He made several points, each one delivered in the calm, methodical manner that was characteristic of his leadership style. First, they had no confirmation that war had actually begun. They had no orders from Moscow authorizing nuclear weapons use. Second, the depth charges might be signals to surface rather than actual attacks. Third, launching a nuclear weapon without authorization from the Soviet leadership could turn a tense situation into an actual war. And fourth, even if they fired and hit a target, the submarine would immediately be destroyed by the American forces surrounding them. They would all die. And for what? To start a war that might still be avoided? The debate lasted for what must have felt like hours, but was probably minutes. Time distorts in moments of extreme crisis. The crew could hear the argument, could sense the tension among their commanding officers. Some accounts suggest other officers were brought into the discussion, that Arkhipov had to argue his case not just to the captain and political officer, but to other senior enlisted men who were also pushing for launching the torpedo. The temperature inside the submarine was now over 122 degrees Fahrenheit, 50 Celsius. Men were lying on the deck, too weak to stand, breathing air that was thick with carbon dioxide and humidity. The submarine was literally dying around them, and the captain wanted to go down fighting. But Arkhipov held firm. He proposed an alternative: surface the submarine, make radio contact with Moscow, get orders before taking such an irreversible action. Yes, surfacing meant facing the American fleet, meant possible capture or humiliation, but it also meant survival, meant avoiding a decision that could trigger nuclear war. His authority as flotilla commander, his reputation from the K-19 incident, his force of personality, all of it came together in that moment to sway the decision. Finally, reluctantly, Captain Savitsky agreed. B-59 would surface. When the submarine broke the surface of the Caribbean Sea, the crew's first sight was overwhelming. American warships everywhere, guns trained on them, helicopters overhead, the massive aircraft carrier USS Randolph dominating the horizon. They had surfaced in the middle of a carrier battle group, vastly outgunned and outmatched. American signals ordered them to identify themselves and depart the area immediately. B-59's captain complied, running the diesel engines to recharge batteries and ventilate the submarine while communicating with the American forces through signal flags and lights. The Americans didn't board the submarine or even demand inspection. They simply wanted the Soviet sub to leave the Caribbean and return to Soviet waters. After a few hours on the surface, B-59 submerged again and began the long journey home, defeated and humiliated, but alive. None of the Americans knew how close they had come to being vaporized by a nuclear torpedo. None of the Soviet submariners knew that at that exact moment on the surface, other events were unfolding that would determine whether the crisis escalated further or de-escalated toward peace. October 27, 1962, the same day Arkhipov refused to launch the nuclear torpedo, was the most dangerous day of the entire Cuban Missile Crisis for multiple reasons. That morning, a U-2 spy plane piloted by Major Rudolf Anderson was shot down over Cuba by a Soviet surface-to-air missile, killing Anderson, the crisis's only direct combat casualty. President Kennedy's military advisors urged immediate retaliation, arguing that the shoot-down proved the Soviets were unwilling to negotiate and that military action was necessary. But Kennedy held off, waiting to see if diplomatic channels could still work. Meanwhile, another U-2 accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace over Siberia, nearly triggering Soviet retaliation. And at the United Nations, negotiations between American and Soviet representatives seemed deadlocked, with neither side willing to make the first concession. If B-59 had fired its nuclear torpedo, destroying an American carrier and killing thousands of American sailors, Kennedy would have faced overwhelming pressure to launch a full-scale military response. Soviet cities would have been targeted by American nuclear missiles, and Khrushchev would have had no choice but to retaliate against American cities. The nuclear exchange that so many feared would have become reality, and all because of a decision made in a desperate moment by officers in a dying submarine who thought they were already at war. Vasili Arkhipov submarine returned to the Soviet Union in late November 1962, after the crisis had been resolved through diplomatic negotiations. Kennedy and Khrushchev had reached an agreement. The Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba, and the Americans would publicly pledge not to invade Cuba and would quietly remove their own nuclear missiles from Turkey. The crisis was over. Humanity had stepped back from the brink, and the world could breathe again. But for the officers and crew of B-59, the return home was not triumphant. They had failed in their mission. They hadn't broken through the American blockade, hadn't protected Soviet interests in Cuba, had been detected and forced to surface by American forces. In the Soviet military culture, which valued success and punished failure, their expedition was seen as a humiliation. Captain Savitsky faced criticism from superiors for allowing his submarine to be detected and forced to surface. The crew was debriefed extensively, their actions scrutinized, their decisions questioned. And through all this, the world remained entirely ignorant of how close B-59 had come to launching a nuclear weapon. Arkhipov received no special recognition for his decision not to launch the torpedo. In fact, the incident was classified at the highest levels. The Soviet leadership didn't want to acknowledge how close a submarine captain had come to starting a nuclear war without authorization. American intelligence had monitored B-59's surfacing, but had no idea about the debate over the nuclear torpedo. They didn't even know Soviet submarines in the Caribbean carried nuclear weapons until years later. Arkhipov continued his naval career, rising through the ranks, commanding other vessels, training new officers, serving his country with the same quiet competence that had defined his earlier service. He was promoted to Rear Admiral and eventually to Vice Admiral, teaching at the Naval Academy, passing on his experience to younger officers. But he never spoke publicly about what happened on October 27, 1962. It was classified, and even if it hadn't been, it wasn't in his nature to seek attention or credit. He had done what he believed was right, had prevented what he saw as a catastrophic mistake, and that was enough for him. His wife Olga vaguely knew that something significant had happened during the Cuban crisis, but even she didn't learn the full details until many years later.
The K-19 incident and the Caribbean deployment both took their toll on Arkhipov's health. The radiation exposure from K-19 caused lasting damage. Many of the men who survived the reactor crisis died prematurely from cancers and other radiation-related illnesses. Arkhipov developed health problems in later years, likely related to that exposure combined with the stresses of submarine service. He retired from the Navy in the mid-1980s with the rank of Vice Admiral, settling into a quiet life in Moscow with his wife. He enjoyed spending time with his family, including his daughter Yelena, and lived modestly on his military pension. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, ending the Cold War and the system he had served his entire adult life. Arkhipov adapted to the new Russia, watching as many of the certainties of his earlier life dissolved: the Communist Party, the Soviet military, the ideological struggle against the West. But through all the changes, he remained who he had always been, a man of duty, discipline, and quiet integrity.
Arkhipov died on August 19, 1998, at the age of 72, from kidney cancer, likely caused by his radiation exposure aboard K-19. His death was noted in obituaries as that of a retired vice admiral, a naval officer who had served his country honorably for decades. But the full story of what he had done on October 27, 1962, remained largely unknown to the public. A few historians knew pieces of the story. American researcher Thomas Blanton of the National Security Archive had investigated the Cuban Missile Crisis extensively and had discovered references to Soviet submarines carrying nuclear torpedoes. But the complete picture only emerged in the early 2000s, when former Soviet officers began speaking more openly about Cold War incidents and Russian archives opened access to previously classified materials. It was only then that the world learned how close Vasili Arkhipov had come to either becoming history's greatest villain or its greatest hero, depending on whether he had said yes or no in that moment under the Caribbean Sea. In 2002, at a conference commemorating the 40th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, several participants, including former U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and former Soviet officials, learned the full story of B-59 and Arkhipov's decision for the first time. McNamara, who had been one of President Kennedy's key advisors during the crisis, was shocked. "We were this close to nuclear war," he said, holding his thumb and forefinger a fraction apart. He had known the crisis was dangerous, but hadn't realized that nuclear weapons had nearly been used. The revelation changed historical understanding of the crisis. It wasn't just diplomats and leaders navigating toward peace, but also individual officers in submarines and air defense installations, making split-second decisions that happened to be the right ones. The margin between survival and catastrophe had been even thinner than anyone realized. Thomas Blanton, who had researched the incident extensively, declared, "A man called Vasili Arkhipov saved the world." The statement seemed hyperbolic at first, but as the details became clear, it appeared increasingly accurate. Recognition of Arkhipav's heroism came slowly but meaningfully. In 2017, nearly 20 years after his death, Arkhipov became the first recipient of the Future of Life Award, established by the Future of Life Institute to honor individuals who had helped prevent existential risks to humanity. The award, given posthumously, was accepted by his daughter Yelena at a ceremony in Cambridge, Massachusetts. FLI President Max Tegmark described Arkhipov as arguably the most important person in modern history for his role in preventing nuclear war. The award included a $50,000 prize, which was given to Yelena to honor her father's legacy. She spoke about her father's humility and sense of duty, describing him as someone who never sought recognition, but simply did what he believed was right. She also revealed that her father had never spoken about the incident at home, that she had only learned the full story after his death when researchers contacted the family. This reticence was typical of Arkhipov's character. He saw no need to publicize his actions or claim credit for preventing catastrophe. He had simply done his job as he understood it. The contrast between Arkhipov's story and that of other Cold War near-miss heroes like Stanislav Petrov reveals interesting patterns about how close humanity came to nuclear war multiple times. Petrov, the Soviet officer who correctly identified a false alarm in 1983, also received recognition only late in life or posthumously. Both men faced situations where protocol and pressure pushed toward using nuclear weapons, and both exercised independent judgment that contradicted what others around them were advocating. But there are also differences. Petrov was dealing with computer systems and satellite data, making a judgment about whether alerts were real or false. Arkhipov was dealing with human beings in a real crisis, arguing against colleagues who genuinely believed they were under attack and should retaliate. Both situations required moral courage and clear thinking under impossible pressure. But Arkhipov's situation was more immediately physical. He could feel the explosions, breathe the foul air, see his crew collapsing from heat exhaustion. The temptation to strike back must have been enormous, yet he resisted. The question of what would have happened if B-59 had launched its nuclear torpedo has been analyzed extensively by historians and military analysts. The most likely scenario is that the torpedo would have hit and destroyed the USS Randolph, a large aircraft carrier with a crew of about 2,500 sailors. The explosion would have been roughly equal to the Hiroshima bomb, about 15 kilotons of TNT equivalent. It would have vaporized the carrier and severely damaged or destroyed several nearby destroyer escorts, killing thousands of American servicemen instantly and condemning thousands more to radiation deaths. The U.S. response would have been immediate and overwhelming. American military commanders in the region had authorization to use tactical nuclear weapons if attacked with nuclear weapons. The rules of engagement during the crisis gave local commanders significant latitude. U.S. forces would have likely responded with nuclear attacks on Soviet installations in Cuba, killing thousands of Soviet military personnel and potentially many Cuban civilians. Soviet forces in Cuba had authorization to use tactical nuclear weapons in their defense, which would have led to further nuclear exchanges. The escalation wouldn't have stopped in the Caribbean. Once nuclear weapons had been used, once thousands of Americans had died in a nuclear attack, President Kennedy would have faced overwhelming pressure from military advisors and the public to launch a full-scale nuclear strike on the Soviet Union. Kennedy was cautious and thoughtful, but he was also a politician who couldn't ignore domestic pressure, and the military establishment was already pushing for stronger actions before any nuclear weapons were used. With an American carrier destroyed by a Soviet nuclear torpedo, the voices calling for massive retaliation would have been overwhelming. American strategic bombers would have been launched, carrying hundreds of nuclear weapons towards Soviet cities and military bases. American ICBMs would have been fired from their silos. Submarine-launched ballistic missiles would have been released from Polaris submarines positioned around the Soviet periphery. The Soviet Union would have detected these launches immediately and faced the choice Khrushchev had tried to avoid: launch everything in retaliation or accept destruction without striking back. Soviet doctrine called for massive retaliation. If the Americans launched, the Soviets would launch everything they had. Within hours of B-59 firing its torpedo in this nightmare scenario, nuclear weapons would have been detonating in Soviet and American cities. Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, all would have been hit by multiple American warheads. New York, Washington, Chicago, Los Angeles, all would have been struck by Soviet ICBMs. NATO allies and Warsaw Pact countries would have been drawn in, with nuclear weapons hitting cities across Europe. The initial exchange would have killed tens of millions immediately. Everyone in the target cities would have been vaporized or killed by blast effects and radiation in the immediate aftermath. But that would have been just the beginning. Nuclear fallout would have spread across both hemispheres, exposing hundreds of millions more to lethal radiation doses. The destruction of cities would have caused firestorms that pumped enormous amounts of smoke and soot into the stratosphere, blocking sunlight and causing a nuclear winter that would drop global temperatures by 20 to 30 degrees Celsius for months or years. Agricultural collapse would have followed, causing mass starvation worldwide. Human civilization might have survived in pockets, but the world as we knew it would have ended. All of this, all the death, destruction, and civilizational collapse would have been triggered by one submarine officer's decision in a moment of extreme stress and limited information. If Arkhipov had agreed with his captain and political officer, if he had said yes instead of no in that moment under the Caribbean Sea, the torpedo would have been launched, the carrier destroyed, and the escalation cascade triggered. The decision point was that simple and that stark. One man, in one moment, had the power to end the world or save it. And he chose to save it, not through any grand heroic action, but simply by saying, let's wait, let's surface, let's get orders before we do something irreversible. It's the ordinariness of the decision that makes it so powerful. Arkhipov didn't need to be brilliant or visionary, just thoughtful and careful. He needed to resist the pressure to act rashly, to question assumptions, to insist on verification before taking catastrophic action. These are not superhuman qualities. They're the basic requirements of good decision-making. But under extreme stress, with limited information and time pressure, even these basic qualities can be extraordinarily difficult to maintain.
The institutional lessons from Archipov's story are profound and disturbing. First, the Soviet command structure that required agreement from 3 officers to launch the nuclear torpedo was a crucial safety mechanism that prevented disaster. If Captain Savitsky alone had authority to launch, the torpedo would have been fired. The requirement for consensus created a veto point where one person exercising good judgment could prevent catastrophe. Modern nuclear command and control systems incorporate similar principles. Multiple people must agree before nuclear weapons can be launched. But these systems only work if the people involved exercise independent judgment, rather than rubber-stamping each other's decisions. Arkhipov could have simply agreed with his superiors to maintain unit cohesion, but he didn't. Second, the lack of communication between B-59 and Soviet command created a situation where submarine officers had to make life-or-death decisions based on incomplete information. If they had been able to radio Moscow and learn that war hadn't started, the pressure to launch would have evaporated. Modern communications have improved, but submarines still operate in communications-denied environments where commanders must make judgments with limited information. Third, the American tactic of using practice depth charges to signal submarines to surface was catastrophically misunderstood by the Soviet submarine crew. What American forces intended as a communication method, surface for identification, was interpreted by stressed Soviet submariners as an attack. This communications failure nearly triggered nuclear war, and it illustrates the dangers of using force or simulated force as a communication method during crises. Both sides were operating with limited understanding of the other's intentions, capabilities, and doctrine. American forces didn't know the Soviet submarines carried nuclear torpedoes. Soviet submarine crews didn't know the depth charges were practice weapons. These mutual misunderstandings created a situation where each side misinterpreted the other's actions, pushing toward escalation that neither side actually wanted. Modern crisis communications have improved, with hotlines and back channels designed to prevent such misunderstandings. But the fundamental problem remains. In tense situations, adversaries may misinterpret each other's actions, and those misinterpretations can cascade rapidly toward conflict. The psychological dimension of Arkhipov's decision deserves examination. What gave him the strength to resist pressure from his captain and political officer, to argue against colleagues who were certain they were right, to insist on caution when boldness might have seemed more appropriate? Part of the answer lies in his previous experience aboard K-19, where he had seen how nuclear technology could go catastrophically wrong, how split-second decisions under pressure could mean the difference between survival and disaster. That experience had taught him to be wary of irreversible decisions, to question assumptions, to insist on verification before acting. Another part of the answer is probably personality. Arkhipov seems to have been someone who valued careful analysis over emotional reaction, who could maintain calm under extreme stress, who had confidence in his own judgment even when others disagreed. But there's also an element of luck. Arkhipov happened to be aboard B-59 because of his role as flotilla commander. If a different officer had been in that position, someone less experienced or more aggressive or more rigid about following doctrine, the decision might have gone differently. Arkhipov's legacy raises difficult questions about how we remember and honor individuals who prevent catastrophes. Heroes who save lives through positive action, firefighters running into burning buildings, soldiers charging enemy positions, are easy to recognize and celebrate. But how do we honor someone whose heroism consisted of not acting, of refusing to do something? Arkhipov's achievement was preventing an action that would have been catastrophic, but proving the counterfactual, demonstrating that his refusal actually saved the world, requires speculating about what would have happened if he had decided differently. Historians can construct plausible scenarios about escalation following a nuclear torpedo launch, but they can't prove with certainty that such escalation would have occurred. Maybe Kennedy would have shown restraint even after an American carrier was destroyed. Maybe the crisis could have been contained even after nuclear weapons were used. These seem unlikely, but they're possible. So Arkhipov's heroism rests partly on speculation about what he prevented rather than certainty about the consequences of his decision. The comparison between Arkhipov and others who faced similar decisions during the Cold War reveals patterns worth examining. There's Stanislav Petrov, who correctly identified a Soviet satellite system false alarm as not indicating an American missile attack. There's Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov in 1983, who refused to report a false alarm of American missiles. There's a Norwegian rocket scientist who launched a scientific rocket that Russian early warning systems briefly mistook as a missile attack. In each case, someone in a crucial position made a decision that prevented potential nuclear war, sometimes by correctly identifying false alarms, sometimes by refusing to act on incomplete information. The disturbing lesson is that nuclear war was prevented multiple times, not primarily through wise policy or brilliant strategy, but through individual judgment in crucial moments by people who happened to make the right call. This suggests that the Cold War nuclear peace was more fragile and contingent than many realized, that we survived partly through luck, the luck of having the right people in the right positions at the right moments. In Russia today, Arkhipov's story is known but not widely celebrated at the official level. The Russian Navy honors him as a distinguished veteran, and some schools and organizations use his story to teach about the Cuban Missile Crisis. But there's no major monument or national holiday commemorating his actions. This may reflect lingering discomfort with the incident. Acknowledging Arkhipov's heroism requires acknowledging how close Soviet officers came to starting nuclear war without authorization, which doesn't reflect well on Soviet military procedures or decision-making. It's easier to focus on the diplomatic resolution of the crisis, on Khrushchev and Kennedy's statesmanship, than on the terrifying moment when a submarine captain wanted to fire a nuclear weapon and was overruled by his executive officer. In the West, Arkhipov is better known thanks to documentaries, articles, and books about the Cuban Missile Crisis, but he remains less famous than other Cold War figures. Most Americans can't name him, though they know about the Cuban Missile Crisis generally. Arkhipov's widow, Olga, became a guardian of his legacy after his death, speaking occasionally to journalists and historians about his husband's character and actions. She described him as a man of principle, who valued human life above military glory, who had seen enough death and destruction to understand that preventing war was more important than winning it. She recalled his reluctance to discuss his naval service, his modesty about his achievements, his focus on family and simple pleasures in retirement. When she learned the full details of what happened on B-59, she said she felt proud but not surprised. It was consistent with the man she had known, someone who would choose the harder right over the easier wrong, who would risk his career and relationships with colleagues rather than make a decision he believed was catastrophically mistaken. Her interviews provided crucial insight into Arkhipov's character and helped establish his historical importance. She died in 2023, having lived to see her husband recognized internationally as someone who had saved the world. The Arkhipov received posthumously in 2017 represented a broader shift in how we think about existential risks and the individuals who prevent them. The award was created to honor people who had helped humanity avoid potential civilization-ending catastrophes, recognizing that prevention of disaster is as worthy of honor as achievement of great accomplishments. Arkhipov was the first recipient, but the award also recognized others who had prevented nuclear incidents, pandemics, or other existential risks. The ceremony included discussions of how modern technology, AI, synthetic biology, advanced weapon systems, creates new existential risks that future Arkhipovs might face. The hope is that by honoring those who prevented past catastrophes, we can encourage future decision-makers to exercise similar caution and judgment when facing potential civilization-ending choices. Whether such honors actually influence behavior in moments of crisis is unclear, but they at least ensure that prevention of catastrophe is recognized and valued. Looking at the Cuban Missile Crisis through the lens of Arkhipov's decision reveals how multiply contingent historical outcomes can be. The crisis is remembered as a triumph of diplomacy, with Kennedy and Khrushchev navigating toward peaceful resolution despite enormous pressure, and that's true. Their leadership was crucial. But the crisis could have escalated catastrophically at multiple points where individual decisions by people far from the centers of power determined outcomes. An air defense commander in Cuba decided to shoot down an American U-2 without authorization, killing the pilot and nearly triggering American retaliation. An American U-2 pilot accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace over Siberia, nearly triggering Soviet air defenses. And Arkhipov refused to launch a nuclear torpedo despite his captain's orders. Each of these individuals made choices that affected whether the crisis escalated or de-escalated. History textbooks focus on the leaders, because that's how we like to think about history, great men making great decisions. But the reality is messier, with crucial decisions distributed among many people, some famous and some obscure, some making good choices and some making bad ones. The overall outcome determined by the aggregate of all these individual decisions. Arkhipov's story is ultimately about the power and responsibility of individual conscience in institutional contexts. He was part of a